The flight deck of Akagi looked like a lacquered temple floor in the half-light, black, slick, sacred to speed. Petty Officer Hattori knelt by the starboard tie-downs, fingers numb inside oil-soaked gloves while he snugged the last chalk against the Nakajima B5 and Kate. The ship moved beneath him like a breathing animal. Every roll swung the horizon a notch and returned it. "Secure," he shouted, the words snatched by wind and swallowed by engine coughs. To his left, armorers fed drum after drum of Type 91 torpedoes with canvas tails, anti-ship weapons that, for the moment, were not wanted. The order of the morning had been land attack. Midway's airfields, fuel tanks, guns. Bomb racks carried 250 and 800-kilogram bombs for the island, as the ordnance officer had said with the dryness of a man reciting a menu. Below deck, on the flag bridge, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo waited for the minute hand to touch the number he had chosen before dawn. Around him, staff fought the strange battle that happens before the battle, math versus fear. Commander Minoru Jinda, brilliant and exhausted, spoke into the narrow vault of the room with his neat, flat voice. "First strike launches on time. Second strike stands by." He did not add, "if required." The words were always implied, like a shadow that never needed to be named. At 0430, the first wave, dive bombers Val and torpedo bombers Kate, loaded for land targets, lifted off from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They went up into a pale sky that smelled of metal and brine. Hattori watched the last Val drop from the bow like a stone and then catch itself, wingtips flexing. The deck crews cheered in short, embarrassed bursts. Cheering was for festivals. This was work. 0530 Midway time. The radio crackled. A Japanese scout float plane skimming low over the sea, voice thin as wire. Other scouts fanned wide. The eyes of Kido Butai, the first air fleet, scanning an ocean too large for any plan to master. Among them, Cruiser Tone's number 4 scout, 30 minutes late getting off the catapult, ran behind schedule and behind fate. A minor delay on paper, a fault line in time. On Akagi's flag bridge, Nagumo's staff plotted the arcs. The search pattern looked like a fan cut from rice paper, beautiful and full of holes. War at sea was always this, elegance held together by ritual and luck. By 0630, the first strike thundered down on Midway Atoll. From the back seat of his B5N, Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga, a quiet man with a chronograph soul, watched the atoll's white arc swell in the windscreen. As bombs walked across sand and eastern islands, anti-aircraft fire stitched the sky with black buttons. American fighters, stubby F-2 as an F-4FS, climbed to die bravely or to survive by accident. Tomonaga's message in clear, clip code came back to Nagumo at 0715. Second attack is necessary to neutralize remaining defenses. Nagumo received it like a stone in the hand. Heavy, certain. He turned to Jinda. "We will rearm the reserve for land attack." Orders moved downward. Return the torpedoes to magazines. Bring up GP bombs again. Fuse delay for structures. Refuel aircraft. In the hangars, Hattori felt the plan change like wind turning a banner. Dolly squealed. Men cursed softly. Crewmen rolled torpedoes back on their cradles, muscling 200-kilogram cylinders under a ceiling that seemed lower with every minute. Aviation fuel ran again through lines that hissed. Gasoline vapor made the air sweet and mean. 0728. A new message slipped in from the east like a knife. Tow number 4, late to its sector, finally spoke. Enemy force sighted 10 ships. 10 ships. The words hung in the room like smoke that would not disperse. Carriers, someone asked a question that mattered. Not specified, the wireless man said, and the 4 syllables felt like a prayer that had broken its teeth. Nagumo's mind walked a tightrope above a mode of doctrine. Admiral Yamamoto's plan was clear on paper. draw the Americans toward Midway, smash them with keto butai, while the main body and submarines enclosed the kill. But the submarines were not yet at their picket line. The main body lay hundreds of miles behind, and doctrine had not done the arithmetic of this morning's reality. Armed aircraft on deck, fuel lines connected, CAP-0 cycling, American land-based raids inbound. 0740 to 0745. Amplifying report. One carrier possibly present. Then minutes that felt like the inside of a seashell. Curved, echoing, inescapable. Nagumo rescinded the rearm for land order, ordered anti-ship torpedoes again. On hangar decks already in motion, the dance reversed direction. Bombs came off, torpedoes came up, refueling paused and resumed in fits. The schizophrenia of preparation turned the carriers into tinderboxes arranged like a square of altars, offerings half-made. Jinda, outwardly calm, argued for immediate launch of what could fly with what they carried. "Strike with what we have," he said softly. "Speed is armor." Nagumo looked at the telltales. Incomplete rearmament, CAP rotations, the need to recover Tomonaga's returning strike. To launch would be to throw a scattered handful instead of a hammer. He chose the hammer and waited. From that decision backward and forward in time, histories would be written. On deck, Hattori only knew this. Every minute made the air sharper with fuel, the bomb carts hotter to the fingers, the nerves like drawn wire. The Americans arrived piecemeal, as if they too had been forced to choose courage over choreography. At 0700 to 0830, Midway base B-26S and TBF Avengers came low with torpedoes, and SBDs came high with bombs. Most died in the attempt, flaming and falling into a sea that took everything with the same indifference. The Zeros dragged downward to kill them, CAP dissolving into individual duels at wavetop height. Each attack failed tactically and succeeded strategically. They pinned the Japanese attention, they bled altitude, they stretched the moment Nagumo needed to complete the flip from land to ship weapons. At 0837, Tomonaga's strike limped back, holes in wings, fuel needles frowning. Protocol and humanity demanded recovery. Japanese decks became carousel and emergency room at once. Zero short on fuel dropped in like stones. Valves with hardly any brakes kissed the deck wires. Hattori and the crew ran with chocks and hoses, cutting lines and hauling men from cockpits that smelled of blood and gasoline. Somewhere under the deck, bombs and torpedoes waited half-mated to planes that would not be launched in time. 0920 to 1020. The sea to the northeast boiled with specks. Enterprise and Yorktown had found their way through a sky-wide maze. American torpedo squadrons, VT-8, VT-6, VT-3, came one after another, their devastators horribly misnamed, slow and noble and doomed. They died in curtains of 7.7 millimeters and 20 millimeters fire, in slashing Zeros, in wakes torn white by near misses. Nearly all were cut down, but they dragged the CP still lower, still wider, still more dispersed. They fixed the Japanese gaze on the waterline. And then, like a chord the composer saves, the dive bombers arrived from above where no one looked anymore. 1020 to 1026. SBD Dauntless from Enterprise in Yorktown tipped over at 14,000 feet into the sun. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, having followed the thin line of a lone destroyer's wake to find the fleet, rolled his squadrons into steep geometry. Kaga's deck, clustered with fueled aircraft and ordnance, presented the flammable logic of a warehouse. Soryu, equally loaded with potential and oxygen, waited her turn. Hattori saw the first bomb fall like a thrown coin that would never land. It struck Kaga and turned metal to sunlight. Secondary explosions walked aft. The deck lifted under him. The world went full of paper, maps, maintenance tags, orders, igniting mid-air and floating like fireflies. On Soryu, 3 hits turned her hangars into furnaces. On Akagi, one perfect bomb near the midships elevator sliced nerves. A single, precise ruin, enough to kill a flagship. On the flag bridge, Jinda grabbed a railing that burned his palm. He looked down on a deck that had become the diagram of a mistake. Fuel lines, bombs, planes, people, all lines converging in fire. Nagumo stood very still, a man who had made the best possible choice a minute too late. Only Hiryu, to the northeast, a little apart, remained whole. On Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi turned loss into velocity. He had not been the one to choose caution. Now he would choose attack. The first counterstrike went up at 10:45, valves with bombs, led by men who knew the maps of the heavens as well as any priest. They found Yorktown and burned her once. The second wave, around 1300, finished the job that Smoke had begun, not knowing that another American carrier had taken Yorktown's role long enough to confuse aim and history. The Japanese airman's bravery wrote black punctuation on the horizon. The ships read it and bled. By mid-afternoon, Hiryu stood alone against the sky, now trained to look back. Enterprise's dive bombers, hunting a final silhouette in a cloud-bitten west, found her near 1700. Bombs walked the flight deck. Yamaguchi said he would go down with his ship. His last act was to put his cap on straight. In the water, clinging to rafts and planks, men watched Hiryu burn and Akagi die, quiet and Kaga and Soryu roll their last. Oil slicked their skin. Salt stung their eyes. Above them, late torpedoes ran still, making little white rages on the blue. Night gathered in Yamamoto, hundreds of miles away in the dark with the main body he had hoped to bring to the cementing blow, ordered withdrawal. The decisive battle he had courted had arrived on its own terms, and a nation's finest air fleet, the Hammer, had shattered on the anvil of an enemy who refused to be choreographed. Hattori, on a raft with 4 other men, counted breaths and stars. A Zero's tire, absurd and patient, floated by, a relic from a moment when everything had still been possible. He thought of routine, the smell of rags in the tool locker, the angle of a spanner, the way the deck woke at dawn. He had mechanics, ached to fix something. Nothing around him could be fixed. The ocean wrote the day in smoke and oil. End of Part 1. Part 2, dusk, the sound of things breaking. The survivors of Akagi were taken aboard Nagumo's flagship cruiser in the indigo hours between decisions. The Admiralty's faces had the gray cast of men who had recited numbers all day and found that none of them added up anymore. Jinda took a pencil he did not need and made a list he already knew by heart. Search gap created by Tone Number 4's late launch and a thin scout plan. Rearm/refuel oscillation. Fuel lines connected, bombs and torpedoes handled twice. CAP pulled down by continuous low-level attacks. Altitudes unstacked. Submarine cordon not yet in place. Divided forces, Aleutian diversion, sapping mass. Enemy intelligence. They seemed to know we were coming. He wrote it small because the page had to hold more than reasons. It had to hold names. When word reached the cruiser that Yamaguchi had refused to be saved, a noise went through the wardroom like cloth torn carefully. No wadding, only that smaller, crueler sound of respect. He believed in the decisive battle, Jinda murmured. He lived it all the way down. Nagumo said nothing. His silence felt earned and unfair at once. From the Hiryu strike that had hurt Yorktown, one airplane came home with a wing shot thin as a promise. The pilot, Ensign Haruki Saito, 22 from Shikoku, eyes that made his mother promise too many things, rolled to a stop on a deck that would later become a photograph in someone else's history book. He wrote his report with fingers that would not stop twitching. Enemy carrier damaged. CP heavy. Approach from Sun vital. Escorts necessary. He did not write I saw men in the water, and the water had faces. Pilots learned what to spare a report. When Hiryu went under fire, Saito helped push ammo boxes over the side to minimize explosions. He felt the deck heat his soles through his tabi socks, heard the wood begin to speak. Crack, 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 like a person whose mouth cannot form words anymore. He obeyed the order to abandon ship with the shamed obedience of a student told to leave class when he most wants to stay. In the sea, he drifted with carpentry, the ship's bones remade as flotsam. At dusk, he looked up and saw a sky full of planes that did not yet know who had won. At Midway, American Marines hosed fires that Japanese bombs had lit in the morning. A Japanese reconnaissance pilot at 30,000 feet saw the atoll as a child's toy again, small and stubborn. He wrote in his log, "Enemy base damaged but not silenced." The phrase would be read in Tokyo and mean one thing in committees and another in kitchens. Words did that. They were another kind of ordnance. Back in the combined fleet signals tent, the staff transmitted Yamamoto's night orders in clip code: protect rescue operations, avoid further day action, prepare for night surface engagement if opportunity. The Admiral's desire for a night battle, Japanese forte, ran up against physics. The distances were wrong. The enemy had already turned the day into an ally that would be hard to evict in the dark. Light cruisers and destroyers prowled black corridors of ocean, hunting a fight that would not come. They found only lifeboats and oil rainbows and the judgment of salt. At sea level, judgment was personal. Hattori's raft found another. The men pulled alongside and did the quick arithmetic of mercy. Someone had a cut that would infect. Someone had swallowed oil. Someone whispered the names of planes as if they were prayers: Val, Kate, Zero, and calmed. A petty officer recited the story of a bomb with a bent fin that had spun on the deck like a child's top, and then, absurdly, sat down and done nothing. They laughed, a small, honest laugh that released a knot of hours. Hattori looked at the stars. He had never cared about stars before. Ships had been his constellations, flight decks his sky. A destroyer's searchlight remade them as facts. They were hauled aboard, counted, offered green tea, so strong it burned gratitude into their throats. A medic cleaned a wound with rag and iodine. The petty officer fell asleep sitting up and dreamed about checking a tie-down only to find it was his own hand. In Tokyo, Admiral Agaki and others would write in diaries with the baffled clarity of men who had expected a different page. Radio Tokyo did not yet speak of loss. It spoke of Aleutians and weather. Mothers listened to the official voice the way one listens to a doctor, measuring the spaces between words for diagnosis. Some of the mothers would be right. On Akagi's quarterdeck, before scuttling torpedoes finished Mercy, Jinda stood and memorized the ship's angles, the curve of the stack, the spot where the flight deck met the sky. Hypothesis turned to memory in less than a day. He told himself he could build a better plan from this kind of grief. He did not say it aloud. Grief does not like to be invited to meetings. The reckoning of reasons came piecemeal, just as the reckoning of planes had. Officers and sailors, techs and cooks, the living wrote their versions. The consensus did not wear any one man's face. We had believed the enemy passive after Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean. He was not. We divided our striking power between Midway and the Aleutians and paid the tax of dispersion. We underestimated intelligence. The Americans had read too much of us. We had read too little of them. Our search plan was elegant and insufficient. The ocean is bigger than elegance. We treated time as obedient. It was not. And then there was the thing beneath the reasons, the pride of decisive battle, inherited from books about battles in seas that did not smell like this. On the cruiser, a chaplain offered prayers in a voice that didn't try to shape the sea. Men bowed or stood or looked at their boots. Yamaguchi's name hung like a bell that would keep ringing in the head. Saito touched the deck with the back of his fingers and whispered something that was more muscle than language. Hattori made another list in his pocket notebook: spanner, chocks, rags. He knew he would never use the list again and wrote it anyway. There's a kind of stubbornness that fixes nothing and saves a man's outline. When Akagi finally slid under, the stern rose and showed its working parts to the sky. Shafts, screws, a geometry of thrust. The ocean accepted the ship with the same etiquette as a spoon taking sugar, stirring until only taste remained. Home ports would greet destroyers trailing survivors with formalities that felt like lies, songs that felt like wearing another man's jacket. A woman in Kure would wet a rag and wipe oil off a face that had belonged to a boy the day before and a veteran now. "You're thinner," she would say, because what else could you say to a man who had watched 4 floating worlds burn? Officers would report to rooms with carpet and maps and present themselves to Yamamoto. The admiral would listen steadily and speak little. If he thought everything after this would be defense, he did not say it then. Saito would be told to train new pilots whose hands shook a little the first time they traced the arc of a dive on a blackboard. Hattori would be assigned to a depot where he would touch planes that would never leave the ground again, turning propellers by hand to feel the balance, because balance had to be found somewhere. Jindo would write memoranda with titles that sounded like sermons on the proper allocation of force, on search patterns in a radar age. Radar, the word itself a foreign heat in the mouth, would become a new weather. The carriers that remained to Japan would sail with a different kind of caution and a smaller kind of hope. Years later, in a small bar near Sasebo, a man would take a napkin and draw the outline of Midway for a friend who had not been there. He would put the friend's beer in the position of Akagi and his own in the place of Hiryu, and push salt shakers around for Soryu and Kaga. He would tip a few grains of salt to show where Yorktown bled. Then he would sweep a hand and erase the map, because the ocean keeps no maps that last. But on June 4th, 1942, from a Japanese side of the bridge windows and the hangar decks and the cockpits and the rafts, the battle was not yet a book. It was orders changing direction, bomb carts reversing course, scout planes late by minutes that turned into years, pilots rolling in the sun, mechanics wishing for a wrench big enough to turn back time, officers reading duty from paper and then from fire. It was the sound of things breaking. Doctrine, luck, metal, breath, and the quiet afterward where men reckon with what is left. If you stand there with them, at the moment before the bombs fall, you feel a nation leaning forward into an answer that will not be kind. If you stay with them after, you learn that even in defeat work continues. The tying of knots, the writing of lists, the training of hands that will hold controls they should never have to hold. You learn that perspective is the only gift the ocean gives back. The knowledge that every command decision is made in air that smells like fuel and paper and fear. That time is the enemy that cannot be seen on any plot. That courage and error often share watch. And you hear, if you listen long enough, the last sentence murmured by a man on a raft to no one. We were beautiful and wrong at the same time. Dawn broke on a smaller fleet. Destroyers wove through oil rainbows, scooping men from the water. The horizon still feathered with smoke where Hiryu had burned. To the southwest, Cruiser Division 7, Mogami and Mikuma, staggered home after a night collision, their wakes wide with shame. American scouts found them at noon. By afternoon, SBDs fell like hawks. Mikuma blossomed, a black flower on flat water. The lesson reached every chart room. Once the sky owns the sea, even cruisers are only long, slow targets. Aboard the flagship, staff ink turned from red arrows to thin lines labeled withdrawal. Yamamoto's order for a night surface action expired against distance and fatigue. The decisive battle navy had to do something it had never rehearsed. Admit the decision had happened without it. 2. Yorktown's Ghost. On June 6th, a message pricked the gloom. Submarine I-168 torpedoed a wounded American carrier under tow. Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond beside her. Cheers were small, guilty. Even victory felt borrowed. In Nagumo's wardroom, a lieutenant said, "At least one blow returned." Jinda answered, not unkindly. We sank the past. They kept the future. 3. What the reports couldn't carry. Back in Kure, the written story shrank to calm nouns. Air groups attrited. Operations continue. Aleutian diversion successful. Unwritten. The smell of aviation gasoline in hangars with bombs half-swapped. The muscle memory chaos when orders reversed. The silence of a captain who had run out of verbs. Petty Officer Hattori, now in a hospital cot, woke at night to the phantom feel of a tie-down wrench in his hand and wept because there was nothing left to tighten. 4. Doctrine on trial in private. In a closed room, the Navy's best minds drew the hour from 07:15 to 10:20 like a surgeon mapping an artery. Search. Too few arcs, tone. For late, no overlap. Deck cycles. Recover, rearm, refuel. Mutually hostile tasks jammed into one window. CAP. Bled down by low-level attacks. Altitude unstacked. Command assumption. Second strike kept as a perfect hammer. The enemy arrived before the hammer was ready. No one called Nagumo a coward. They called time a traitor and reconnaissance a broken promise. One captain said softly, "We worship concentration of force," and then scattered it. Across oceans, across tasks, across minutes. 5. Replacements you can't replace. Shipyards could lay keels. Schools could not lay experience. The 4 carriers had carried more than planes. They carried ecosystems. Armorers who could flip a hangar in 40 minutes. Chiefs who smelled a fuel leak 2 compartments away. Landing signal officers who could talk a pilot down through a crosswind by cadence alone. The pipeline Apama, Tsukuba, Atsuji would fill cockpits with brave boys. The war would demand old hands it could no longer afford. 6. Letters, sent and unsent. Ensign Saito began a letter to the mother of a gunner lost on Hiryu. He laughed at something trivial just before the hit. There was no fear, which is the best we can wish for anyone. He stopped, unsure whether mercy made the sentence a lie. He folded the page into his diary. Years later, he would read it aloud to a class and say, "History is also about what we don't mail." 7. The country adjusts its mirror. Radio Tokyo emphasized Attu and Kiska. Newspapers printed pilots with scarves and unnamed decks. Housewives queued for sweet potato, listening between syllables for ship names that never came. In an Osaka playhouse, a drama about a samurai breaking his sword and fighting with the scabbard closed early when the lead was drafted to a destroyer. A reviewer wrote one line, "Sometimes the scabbard is heavier than the blade." 8. Yamamoto's quiet arithmetic. On Yamato, the commander-in-chief measured options with a gambler's fatal clarity. He could not replace 4 flight decks or their air crews before America built 8. He could try to reclaim initiative in the Solomons. He would. He could sharpen night fighting. He did. None of the moves replaced the hour when compounded reasonable choices had aligned against him. 9. Jinda's new gospel. Jinda drafted memoranda that read like psalms to the new gods. Search before strike. More arcs, redundancy, radar when possible. Deck discipline. Never refuel and rearm together. Keep hangars clean. Speed over perfection. Launch with what you have when the window opens. Mass, not dispersion. No more Aleutian detours when carriers are at stake. He ended one paper with a sentence his superiors circled twice. Humility is a weapon. 10. The Shrine by the Sea. Each June, a dwindling line of men met at a seaside shrine. Someone fixed the frayed bell rope because broken gear made them itch. They poured a little sake for ships that no longer had names. They told jokes only men who have been on fire can tell. When the laughter thinned, they faced east and listened. There was nothing to hear except their own breathing. That was enough. 11. What Midway meant from their side. Ask them, and they would not say luck alone, nor genius of the enemy alone. They would say, we were out-timed by broken reconnaissance, by deck routines we treated as destiny, by courage that forced our eyes downward, by an enemy who read our mail and refused our choreography. They would add, we were brave. Both could be true. Both were. 12. Epilogue. A mechanic's prayer. Hattori, posted to a depot at Apama, taught boys to safety wire bolts they would never touch in combat. On his lunch breaks, he turned dead propellers by hand to feel the balance he could still control. Once he sketched a carrier deck from memory, each tie-down marked, each elevator square. At the bottom he wrote, June 4th taught me the ocean has two winds, the one in your face and the one made of time. Trim for both. Midway, seen through Japanese eyes, is not villains and fools. It is professionals inside a beautiful doctrine that couldn't bend fast enough. It is decisions made in air that smells like fuel and paper and fear. It is 5 minutes when all the small reasons added up to history.